Hi class, in this last part of Chapter 15 we want to talk about clusters of stars. So why are clusters important, and what kinds of clusters do we see out there, and what can we tell about clusters if we look at all the different stars that make it up? What information can we get about the cluster? So two types of clusters are open and globular clusters. Open clusters are it's a collection of kind of diffuse stars, not as many stars, and they're kind of spread out. Globular clusters, this example on the right, is a very dense, compact region of stars. And it turns out that the majority of the open clusters are found in the disk of the Milky Way. We'll talk about the Milky Way in a little more detail in a coming chapter, but this was mentioned a while back, just the kind of the general structure of the galaxy that we live in. There's a disk component, there's a halo component that kind of surrounds the disk, there's a bulge in the center, but the open clusters tend to live kind of in the disk part of the galaxy. That's where a lot of stars are being formed, and so these are typically younger clusters of stars, and we'll talk about how we know that. And then the globular clusters tend to live out in the halo, and they tend to be older, as we'll talk about and figure out how we understand that. So a globular cluster is a very dense cluster of stars. There could be 1,000,000 stars packed into a small region of space. The open cluster might only have a few thousand stars, kind of loosely packed in a region, but packed in isn't a great word. They're just kind of distributed in this region of space, but they're all kind of associated with each other. They were all formed out of the same material, the same big cloud of gas, but they're not very dense. They're not very compact. They're not very packed in. There might be a couple thousand stars there, and there might be several light years, 30 so light years across in this cluster or so. Whereas a globular cluster, there could be 1,000,000 or so stars in there, packed into an area, much smaller, maybe 60 to 150 light years apart. And if you imagined the Earth, its nearest neighbor is about 4 light years away. If we were inside a globular cluster, in kind of the central part of this globular cluster here, there could be like 1,000 stars that close to us. So imagine 1,000 stars, closer to us than the closest star that we have right now. And these stars can have a variety of brightnesses. They could be really big and bright. They could be small and dim. There could be a variety of things. So the sky, if you were on a planet inside of a globular cluster, the sky would just be incredible, an incredibly dense packing of stars around you. So how do we tell the age of a cluster? How do we know that these globular clusters are older and these open clusters are younger? How do we know this? Well, the first thing we have to remind ourselves is that when we look at stars, the big, massive, hot blue stars, they don't live very long. They're the first stars to die. And then the next stars to die are usually the kind of the whitish looking stars. And you remember that color, kind of when we talk about white and blue, what we mean is that the blue star is really hot, so hot that it's giving off all the different colors of the rainbow, but it's giving off a lot of blue light. What we mean by a white star is maybe a star a little bit cooler, and it's giving more or less equal amounts of the colors of the spectrum of the rainbow, and so it looks more white. A hotter star is going to give off more blue, so it has a blue tint to it. And then so the white stars are going to not live they're going to live a little longer than the blue stars. The yellow stars are going to live a little bit longer than the white stars. The orange stars are going to live a little bit longer than the yellow, and the red stars are going to live the longest. Those are the red dwarfs, for example, that live for billions, hundreds of billions of years, possibly. So we understand the ages of stars depend on their mass ultimately, but that's also related to their color when they're on the main sequence. So what we do is we look at a cluster and we measure the luminosity and temperature of every star that we can. And we plot those stars on an HR diagram. So what this shows is a plot of the Pleiades cluster. And these little triangles represent individual stars. So you look at the Pleiades cluster, and it's an open cluster, and you try to measure as many stars as you can. Try to measure their temperature, try to measure their brightness, and again you do this using various techniques. You look at the spectrum of each star to get its temperature. You try to measure its distance and compare that to the apparent brightness to get its luminosity. And so you get this information about the temperature and the luminosity of these stars, and you plot them on the HR diagram. And again, as most stars do, you'll have a bunch of stars that line up on the main sequence. You'll have your cool red stars over here, your kind of warmer yellow stars here, your even warmer kind of whitish stars here, and your even warmer blue stars. But you'll notice at some point you'll start to see some stars that are not on the main sequence. These are stars that used to be on the main sequence, but they're no longer on the main sequence. These are stars that are starting to die. And so what you do is you look for this point, and it's not obvious. It's, you have to really look at it carefully and study it carefully, but there's a point at which the stars, there's a star that's kind of the last one left on the main sequence. That's going to be like the next one that's going to die, the next one that's going to start to leave the main sequence. That star is at a point that we call the turn-off point. That's a point at which the stars are currently turning off the main sequence, becoming giant stars, starting to die. Stars that are starting to die are turning off the main sequence, becoming giant stars. They're going to get a little bit brighter because they're going to get bigger, and they're going to get a little bit cooler, again, because the outer layers are getting bigger. As the outer layers expand, the star gets brighter, but it also gets cooler. Right? So these stars are becoming giant stars. So again, what we do is we look at the main sequence, we plot these stars, and we see a main sequence. We look at the last star up on the main sequence that's just about to die. That point is called the turn-off point. And the lifetime then of that star, roughly, gives us the age of the whole cluster. So the idea is that all these stars were formed out of one cloud of gas and dust. They were all formed at the same time. And so if we look on the HR diagram for the star that's just about to die, that position on the HR diagram indicates a particular lifetime. And so these stars way up here in the blue part might only live a couple million years. The stars here might live 10 million years. The stars in here might live about 100 million years. And so if a star that only lives about 100 million years looks like it's just about to die, because the other stars just ahead of it on the main sequence are no longer on the main sequence. A star that's just about to die that has a lifetime of 100 million years, that means that the whole cluster is 100 million years old, because all these stars formed at the same time. So this idea is called the turn-off point. Again, we plot all the stars in a cluster on an HR diagram, and we look for the kind of the next star that's about to die. That's this turn-off point. And we do this with other clusters too. So we can compare. This diagram shows 4 different clusters. These little diamonds are these guys up here. The Pleiades are the little triangles that we saw. They have a turn-off point of about 100 million years. The Hades cluster are these X's. You can see all these X's clustered in here, and they start to turn off right in here. So this age right here is about 1 billion years, a little more than 1 billion years old. All right, right in there. So ahead of that, so 1 billion years is right in here. If you really look at this carefully, and it isn't easy to see on this, but if you look at this very carefully, the turn-off point is about 650 million years. So not quite 1 billion years, but it's close. So the turn-off point of these little X's is what we're looking at. And so you have to look at it very carefully. All right. Then there's this cluster, NGC 188, and that's these little squares. And you can see they turn off way down here. The turn-off point's over here. And so this is a much older cluster, much older cluster, because stars that are dying, that are just about to die right now, are way down here on the main sequence. Those lifetimes are more than 10 billion years old. And so, again, analyzing this really carefully suggests that this cluster is probably about 7 billion years old. And so, again, it isn't obvious. This position right here says 10 billion years, or actually, yeah, this would be 10 billion years right here. This would be about where our sun is. And just ahead of it up in here is probably the turn-off point. It's, again, hard to see in here. You'd have to look at it really carefully. So less than 10 billion years, so about 7 billion years is a good estimate. Right? So they can determine the ages of these clusters by making one assumption, and that is that they all formed from the same cloud of gas and dust. And there is evidence of that. There's some things you can look at that suggest that that's true. It could possibly happen that a bunch of stars weren't formed from the same cloud, but they kind of collided, or didn't collide, but they eventually kind of got closer to each other and occupied nearly the same region of space. That's a possibility. It's not as likely as if all the stars just formed out of the same cloud. And so to know that, we kind of look at the stars, we look at their chemical composition, and we see that they're all very similarly composed. They all have very similar chemical compositions, and that is another piece of evidence that suggests that they all formed from the same cloud of gas and dust. and they formed then at about roughly the same time. So that's how we determine ages of clusters. And again, the globular clusters tend to be really, really old, and they live kind of out in the halo of the galaxy, and the open clusters tend to live in the disk part of the galaxy where we are. Right? So we compare these turnoff points with our understanding of how stars live and die to calculate the age of the clusters. So this is another example. Some of the oldest clusters, some of the oldest things in the universe, or in our galaxy at least, are these globular clusters. And some of the oldest ones are about 13 billion years old. And we can see that this is again another plot of a cluster, and you can kind of see the turnoff point. The sun is here. Stars that live a little bit about the same age as our sun are dying. Our sun is going to live about 10 billion years. And if we study this HR diagram really carefully, which again it isn't obvious here, you have to really look at the details here. But this particular cluster would have a lifetime of about 13 billion years, or have an age of about 13 billion years. So globular clusters are some of the oldest things in the galaxy that we can measure. So this last part of Chapter 15 was fairly brief. It just talked about clusters, the two different types, open and globular clusters. You don't need to memorize numbers, but just know that open clusters are loosely packed and just a few thousand stars, whereas globular clusters are much more densely packed and contains hundreds of thousands and possibly a million stars. So a very compact cluster of stars. And again, the open clusters live kind of more in the disk part of the galaxy, and the globular clusters live in more of the halo part of the galaxy. And then we measure the age of these clusters by looking at the stars, and we plot the stars on an HR diagram, and we look at the stars that are just about to die. And that tells us how old the whole cluster is, because we assume that all the stars were born at the same time. So that wraps up Chapter 15. And in the next few chapters, we'll talk more about this process of stars being born, and then the process of stars living their normal lives, and as they die, we'll look at more of the details inside of stars as to how they live their lives, how they die, how they burn hydrogen into helium, and how helium can be burned into other things, and how we get carbon and oxygen and all that good stuff.